Marcus Chen had never seen a sunrise, but he could feel the warmth of the industrial floodlights burning against his skin as they dragged him into the concrete room. What his captors didn't know would save his life and destroy theirs. The kidnapping happened on a Tuesday morning in downtown Portland. Marcus had been walking the same route to his job at the radio station for 3 years, his white cane tapping rhythmically against the sidewalk as he navigated the familiar path. The sound of footsteps behind him wasn't unusual. Rush hour brought crowds of commuters, but something felt different about these particular steps. They matched his pace too perfectly, slowed when he slowed, stopped when he stopped at the crosswalk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had developed heightened senses over his 28 years of blindness. His mother used to joke that he could hear a pin drop in the next room, smell rain coming from miles away, and sense someone's mood just from their breathing pattern. These skills had served him well as a late-night radio host, where his voice had become a comfort to insomniacs and night shift workers across the Pacific Northwest. But nothing had prepared him for the rough hands that grabbed him as he turned onto Fifth Avenue. "Don't make a sound," a gravelly voice whispered against his ear. The man smelled like stale cigarettes and motor oil. Another set of hands grabbed his other arm, and Marcus felt himself being pushed toward what sounded like a running vehicle. His cane clattered to the sidewalk. "Help!" Marcus shouted, but a cloth was pressed against his mouth and nose. The chemical smell made his head spin, and darkness, the same darkness he'd known his entire life, consumed him. When consciousness returned, Marcus found himself in a hard wooden chair. His wrists were bound behind his back with what felt like zip ties cutting into his skin. The air was stale and carried the scent of mildew and concrete. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the hum of electrical equipment and the occasional drip of water. "He's awake," said a voice he didn't recognize. This one was higher-pitched, nervous. "Good," the gravelly voice from the street. Marcus Chen, age 28, works at KPNW radio station, lives alone in that little apartment on Hawthorne Boulevard. Marcus's blood ran cold. They knew where he lived. They knew where he worked. This wasn't random. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Heavy footsteps circled around his chair. "Your little radio show has been causing problems, Marcus. Last month's expose on Westbridge Construction? That was a mistake." Westbridge Construction. Marcus remembered the investigation well. He'd spent weeks researching the company's connection to several questionable city council decisions. The story had aired on a Friday night, and by Monday morning, 3 city officials had resigned. The construction company's stock had plummeted. "I reported the truth," Marcus said. "The truth," the gravelly voice spat. "Your version of the truth cost some very important people a lot of money, and now you're going to pay for it." A third voice joined the conversation, older and more refined. "Mr. Chen, we represent certain interests that were adversely affected by your journalism. We're going to need you to record a retraction, a very specific retraction that admits you fabricated evidence." "I won't do that." "Oh, but you will." The older voice moved closer. "You see, we've developed some very effective methods of persuasion, methods that work particularly well on people who depend so heavily on their other senses." Marcus heard the scraping of metal against concrete, like equipment being moved into position. Then came the electric hum, growing louder. "Sensory overload can be quite educational," the older voice continued. "We're going to start with light, intense, blinding light, the kind that burns through your eyelids and makes your brain feel like it's on fire." If Marcus could have seen their faces, he might have smiled at the irony. Instead, he kept his expression neutral. "You're going to sit here under these lights," the nervous voice added, "until you agree to make that recording. Hours, if necessary. Days." The human eye wasn't meant to endure this kind of intensity. A switch clicked, and Marcus felt the immediate warmth of powerful lights against his face. He could sense the brightness even through his closed eyelids. Not as sight, but as heat and pressure. "This is just the beginning," the gravelly voice said. "These are industrial floodlights, the kind they use on construction sites. Each one is 50,000 lumens. We have 12 of them pointed directly at your face." Marcus had heard of light torture before, mostly in documentaries about enhanced interrogation techniques. The principle was simple. Constant, overwhelming brightness that made sleep impossible, caused severe headaches, and eventually led to hallucinations and psychological breakdown. It was particularly effective because humans were hardwired to seek darkness for rest and recovery. The heat was already becoming uncomfortable against his skin. He could smell the ozone from the powerful bulbs, hear the cooling fans working to keep the equipment from overheating. The funny thing about light torture, the older voice explained, like a professor giving a lecture, is that it works on multiple levels. Physical discomfort from the heat, psychological stress from the inability to escape, and neurological disruption from the constant stimulation of your optic nerves. Hours passed. Marcus could feel sweat beading on his forehead, running down his cheeks. The zip ties had rubbed his wrists raw. His captors took turns sitting in the room, occasionally asking if he was ready to cooperate, if he wanted to make the recording that would end his suffering. Marcus said nothing. The psychological aspect of their torture method relied heavily on the victim's desperation to escape the light, to find darkness and relief. But Marcus had never known anything except darkness. The brightness they were subjecting him to was certainly hot and uncomfortable, but it held none of the psychological terror they intended. He used the time to listen, to learn about his captors and his surroundings. The gravelly voice belonged to someone who breathed heavily, probably a smoker with poor cardiovascular health. The nervous voice had a slight lisp and tapped his foot when he was anxious. The older voice wore expensive shoes that clicked against the concrete floor. Leather soles, not rubber. The room was large, based on the echo when one of them coughed. There was a loading dock nearby. Marcus could hear the occasional truck backing up, that distinctive beeping sound. They were in an industrial area, probably a warehouse. Still nothing to say, the older voice asked, as Marcus estimated the 6th hour began. "I'm comfortable," Marcus replied truthfully. This seemed to frustrate them. Marcus heard whispered conversations, heated arguments about increasing the intensity, about trying different methods. "Maybe he's tougher than we thought," the nervous voice suggested. "Nobody's that tough," the gravelly voice responded. "We just need to give it more time." But Marcus could hear the doubt creeping into their voices. Their perfect method wasn't working, and they couldn't understand why. As the 8th hour approached, Marcus made a decision. He'd learned enough about his captors and his location. It was time to reveal the truth that would shatter their confidence and turn their weapon against them into the key to his freedom. Marcus had always been good at reading people, but blindness had taught him to read situations with surgical precision. The shift in his captor's energy was palpable now. Their confident torture method was failing, and doubt was creeping in like water through cracks in a foundation. "Turn them up higher," the gravelly voice commanded, frustration bleeding through his attempted authority. "They're already at maximum," the nervous voice replied. "Any higher and we'll blow the circuit breakers. Then get more lights." "Where exactly am I supposed to find more industrial floodlights at 9 o'clock at night?" Marcus listened to their argument with growing amusement. These weren't professional interrogators. They were amateurs who had watched too many movies and thought they understood psychological torture. Real professionals would have researched their target, understood his vulnerabilities, and prepared backup methods. The older voice, the one with expensive shoes, seemed to be thinking along the same lines. "Perhaps we need to reconsider our approach." "Give me 5 more hours," a gravelly voice insisted. "Nobody can withstand this intensity for 12 straight hours." But Marcus wasn't just withstanding it, he was using it. The heat from the lights was helping him map the room more precisely. Air currents moved differently around the hot bulbs, creating thermal patterns he could sense against his skin. The electrical hum gave him sonic landmarks. He now knew there were 3 lights mounted on stands to his left, 4 directly in front, 3 to his right, and 2 behind him, positioned to eliminate any possible shadow. More importantly, he'd been counting their movements, timing their shifts, learning their routines. Gravelly voice checked on him every hour on the hour, always approaching from his right side. Nervous voices came by every 20 minutes, pacing in irregular patterns. The older voice made periodic visits, usually after the other 2 had reported no progress. Around the 10th hour, a new player entered the game. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "What the hell is taking so long?" The voice was sharp, impatient, with the kind of authority that made the other three straighten up immediately. "He's being stubborn," a gravelly voice explained, defensive. "But he'll break. They always do." "Always do?" The new voice moved closer to Marcus. "Do you have any idea how much money we're hemorrhaging every hour this takes? Westbridge's stock is still in freefall. The city council investigation is expanding, and you three idiots are playing with Christmas lights." Marcus filed away this information. Whoever this was, they were the real power behind the operation. The others were just hired muscle and middle management. "The method is sound," the older voice protested. "Light deprivation followed by overwhelming brightness has been proven effective in—" "I don't want to hear about your research," the authority figure snapped. "I want results. If this doesn't work in the next 2 hours, we're moving to more direct methods." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Direct methods meant physical violence, possibly permanent harm. Marcus felt his first real spike of concern since this ordeal began. But he also sensed opportunity. The pressure they were feeling meant they were running out of time. Someone was expecting them to produce results quickly, which suggested this wasn't a long-term kidnapping operation. They needed him to record the retraction soon, probably before morning. After the authority figure left, the 3 original captors fell into anxious discussion. "Maybe we should try something else," a nervous voice suggested. "Heat, cold, noise." "The lights will work," a gravelly voice insisted, but his conviction was wavering. "What if there's something wrong with him?" the older voice mused. "Some kind of medical condition that makes him resistant to light torture?" Marcus almost laughed. There was definitely something medically wrong with him from their perspective, but it wasn't resistance. It was immunity. The 11th hour passed, the 12th. Marcus felt genuinely tired now, not from the lights but from sitting in the same position for so long. His shoulders ached, and the zip ties had rubbed his wrists raw. But psychologically, he felt stronger than when they'd started. "This is impossible," a nervous voice muttered during one of his pacing sessions. "Nobody just sits there like this. He should be begging us to turn them off by now." "Maybe he's tougher than we thought," a gravelly voice admitted grudgingly. "Or maybe," the older voice said slowly, "there's something we don't know about him." Marcus tensed. That was dangerously close to the truth. "What kind of something?" a nervous voice asked. "I don't know. Medical records, psychological profile. We focused on his work, his story, his investigation. But what about him personally?" This was the moment Marcus had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. If they dug deeper into his background, they'd discover his blindness quickly enough. Public records, medical history, even basic observation of his apartment would reveal the truth. But they hadn't done their homework, and now they were 12 hours into a failed torture session with pressure mounting from above. "His apartment," a gravelly voice said suddenly. "When we grabbed him, did anyone notice anything unusual?" "Like what?" "I don't know. The way it was set up, maybe?" Marcus held his breath. They'd been inside his apartment. Had they noticed the braille books, the talking clock, the way his furniture was arranged with clear pathways? "It was dark," a nervous voice said. "We were focused on making sure he lived alone, checking for security systems. Maybe we should go back, look around more carefully." "No time," the older voice cut in. "The boss wants this finished tonight. If the lights aren't working, we try something else." They huddled in the corner, whispering urgently. Marcus caught fragments of their conversation. Hot water, electric shock, pressure points. None of it sounded pleasant. Then a nervous voice said something that changed everything. "What if we're overthinking this? Maybe he just can't see how bright the lights actually are." Silence fell over the room like a blanket. "What do you mean?" a gravelly voice asked slowly. "I mean, what if he's, blind?" The word hung in the air like an accusation. Marcus felt his heart rate spike for the first time since this ordeal began. "That's ridiculous," the older voice said, but there was uncertainty in his tone. "Is it? Think about it. When we grabbed him, he had that white stick. I thought it was just a walking stick for old people, but—" "It was a cane," a gravelly voice said quietly. "A white cane." Quote, the pieces were falling into place in their minds. Marcus could practically hear their thoughts reorganizing, their confidence crumbling as they realized the magnitude of their mistake. "The way he moves his head," a nervous voice continued, gaining confidence in his theory. He doesn't look at us when we talk. His eyes don't track movement. And he never asked us to turn off the lights, the older voice added, realization dawning. Never complain about the brightness, just the heat. Test it, gravelly voice commanded. Marcus heard footsteps approaching. A hand waved in front of his face, close enough that he could feel the air movement. No reaction. Move your hand if you can see this, a voice commanded. Marcus considered his options. He could continue the charade, but they were already piecing together the truth. Better to control the revelation than let them stumble through it. I can't see your hand, Marcus said calmly. I can't see anything. I was born blind. The silence that followed was profound. Marcus could hear their breathing, the electrical hum of the useless lights, the distant sound of traffic outside. But from his captors, nothing. Then, quietly, a nervous voice said, "We've been torturing a blind man with light for 12 hours. Shut up, gravelly voice snapped, but his authority was gone. This is unbelievable, the older voice muttered. 12 hours. 12 hours of the most expensive lighting equipment we could rent, and he can't even see it. Marcus almost felt sorry for them. Almost. So what now? A nervous voice asked. Do we tell the boss? Are you insane? A gravelly voice exploded. You want to explain to him that we've been sitting here all night accomplishing nothing because we didn't bother to check if our victim was blind? Well, what's the alternative? We figure out something else, fast. But Marcus could hear the defeat in their voices. Their perfect plan had collapsed, their confidence was shattered, and they were running out of time. The dynamic had shifted completely. You know, Marcus said conversationally, I've been thinking about your offer, the retraction. They fell silent, hanging on his words. The thing is, I can't retract a story that's true, but I might be able to help you with your real problem. What do you mean? The older voice asked, suspiciously. Your problem isn't the story I aired. Your problem is that the story opened an investigation that's still ongoing. The city council, the FBI, probably the state attorney general by now, killing the messenger won't stop the message. Marcus paused, letting this sink in. But I might know a way to redirect that investigation, make it focus on the small fish while the big fish swim away safely. He had their complete attention now. The failed torture session had left them desperate, and desperate people made poor decisions. What kind of way? A gravelly voice asked. Marcus smiled. For the first time since this ordeal began, he held the cards. Let me make a different kind of recording for you. Not a retraction. Something much more valuable. But first, we need to discuss terms. Terms? The authority was back in a gravelly voice, but it rang hollow. I help you solve your real problem, and you let me go. Simple exchange. And if we refuse? Marcus shrugged as much as the zip ties allowed. Then you can explain to your boss why 12 hours of light torture failed, because nobody thought to check if I could actually see. I'm sure he'll be understanding. The threat was subtle but clear. They were already in deep trouble with their superior. Admitting their incompetence would likely have serious consequences. What exactly are you proposing? The older voice asked. Marcus had been thinking about this for hours, building a plan piece by piece. These people were connected to Westbridge Construction, but they weren't the real power. They were middle management, expendable assets who could be sacrificed to protect the people higher up the food chain. I record a new story, one that reveals how I was approached by someone claiming to represent Westbridge, offering me money to fabricate the original investigation. I tell the world that I refused, but that this person threatened me and now I'm in fear for my life. He paused, letting them process this. The recording gets released anonymously if anything happens to me. Your boss gets what he wants, doubt cast on the original story. But more importantly, law enforcement gets a new target to focus on, someone to blame for the whole mess. Who? A nervous voice asked. Marcus smiled again. That depends on how badly you want this problem to go away. The warehouse fell into contemplative silence as Marcus's proposal hung in the air. He could hear the subtle sounds of three men weighing their options against their desperation. The expensive shoes of the older voice tapped against the concrete floor in a nervous rhythm, while the nervous voice had stopped his pacing entirely. The gravelly voice was breathing harder, the wheeze of a smoker under stress. "You're suggesting we frame someone," the older voice said carefully. "I'm suggesting we give law enforcement exactly what they're looking for, a convenient villain to blame for this entire mess. Someone whose downfall serves everyone's interests." Marcus had spent the last few hours thinking through the politics of his kidnapping. Westbridge Construction wasn't operating in a vacuum. There were city officials, contractors, maybe even federal connections involved in the corruption he'd exposed. His story had pulled on a thread that was unraveling a much larger tapestry of criminal activity. "Who did you have in mind?" a gravelly voice asked. "That depends on your organizational chart. Who's expendable? Who's been getting too greedy, asking for a bigger cut, or becoming a liability in other ways?" Marcus was fishing, but their silence told him he'd struck close to home. In any criminal organization, there was always someone who'd outlived their usefulness. "There's a possibility," the older voice admitted reluctantly. "Good. Now here's how this works. You cut these zip ties, give me some food and water, and let me think through exactly how to structure this recording. I'll need details about this person, enough to make the story credible. In exchange, you get a narrative that redirects all the heat away from the people who matter. And then? Then you drive me back to downtown Portland, drop me off somewhere public, and we both pretend this never happened. I go back to my life, you go back to yours, and everyone wins." A nervous voice spoke up. "What's to stop you from going to the police after we release you?" Marcus had anticipated this question. What would I tell them? That 3 people I can't identify kidnapped me from a location I can't describe and tortured me with lights I couldn't see? I never saw your faces, I don't know where I am, and I can't prove any of this happened. It was a calculated risk, but Marcus was betting on their amateur status. Professional criminals would have contingency plans for witness elimination. These 3 were improvising, which meant they'd take the path of least resistance. "Besides," Marcus continued, "if I wanted to cause problems for you, I'd have done it hours ago when you first grabbed me. I could have screamed, fought back, tried to escape. Instead, I sat here quietly while you figured out your lights don't work on blind people." Gravelly voices let out a bitter laugh. "You knew the whole time, didn't you? That we were wasting our time. I knew you hadn't done your research. Professional kidnappers would have known about my disability before they ever grabbed me. Professional interrogators would have had backup methods ready. You 3 are smart enough to be dangerous, but not experienced enough to be efficient." The assessment stung, but it was accurate, and they knew it. "Cut him loose," the older voice decided, "but keep him tied to the chair, just his hands." Marcus felt the zip ties fall away from his wrists, blood flowing back into his fingers with painful prickles. He flexed his hands, working feeling back into them while maintaining his casual demeanor. "Now," he said, "tell me about your expendable friend." For the next hour, Marcus learned about Deputy City Planning Commissioner Jake Morrison. According to his captors, Morrison had been taking bribes from multiple construction companies, not just Westbridge. He'd been getting increasingly reckless, demanding higher payments, and recently had started making noise about writing a tell-all book if his demands weren't met. "Perfect," Marcus said when they finished their briefing. "Morrison fits the profile exactly. Mid-level official with access to high-level decisions, financial pressures that would make him susceptible to bribery, and arrogant enough to think he could blackmail people more powerful than himself." "So you'll do it?" a nervous voice asked. "I'll do it, but I need you to understand something first. Once I make this recording, there's no going back. Morrison's life is going to be destroyed. His career, his reputation, probably his freedom. You sure he deserves that?" The question was partly moral curiosity and partly tactical maneuvering. Marcus wanted to understand exactly who he was dealing with. "Morrison's been skimming money meant for low-income housing projects," Gravelly voice said flatly. "Families are living in substandard conditions because he diverted funds to line his own pockets. Whatever happens to him, he's earned." Marcus nodded. He'd investigated enough corruption cases to know that the people at the bottom of the food chain, the families waiting for decent housing, the workers dealing with unsafe conditions, were always the ones who suffered most when officials took bribes. "All right, here's how we structure the story." Over the next 2 hours, Marcus crafted a narrative that was both believable and devastating. The fictional Jake Morrison had approached him 3 weeks before the original Westbridge story aired, claiming to represent, quote, "concerned citizens who wanted to expose corruption in city government." Morrison had provided documents, insider information, and detailed knowledge of bid rigging processes. But as Marcus had investigated further, he discovered that Morrison was actually behind much of the corruption himself. The deputy commissioner had been using his position to steer contracts toward companies that paid him kickbacks, including but not limited to Westbridge Construction. The beauty of this story, Marcus explained as he refined the details, is that it doesn't contradict anything I reported originally, it just adds context. Morrison was feeding me information to take down his competitors while protecting his own operations. The recording itself was a masterpiece of investigative journalism turned weapon. Marcus used his professional radio voice, the same calm authority that had made his late-night show popular with listeners seeking truth in a world full of spin. This is Marcus Chen with an urgent update to last month's investigation into Westbridge Construction and city planning corruption. Over the past several weeks, I've uncovered disturbing evidence that my original investigation was compromised from the very beginning. He went on to detail Morrison's alleged approach, the deputy commissioner's promises of insider access, and Marcus's growing suspicions about his source's true motives. The story painted Morrison as a master manipulator who had used the media to eliminate his competition, while positioning himself as a concerned whistleblower. I'm releasing this information now because I believe Deputy Commissioner Morrison has become aware of my continued investigation into his activities. 2 days ago, I received a phone call threatening legal action if I pursued this story further. Yesterday, I noticed someone following me to and from work. Marcus paused the recording, looking toward where he estimated his captors were standing. "This is where it gets interesting," he told them. "I'm going to say that I've prepared a detailed report with evidence of Morrison's corruption and that I've placed copies in secure locations with instructions for release if anything happens to me." "But there is no report," a nervous voice pointed out. "Not yet, but there will be. You're going to help me create it." Over the following hours, Marcus's captors became unwilling collaborators in an elaborate frame job. Using their knowledge of Morrison's actual corrupt activities, Marcus constructed a comprehensive case file that would satisfy any investigator's scrutiny. The irony wasn't lost on him. These same people who had kidnapped and tortured him were now helping him build a story that would redirect law enforcement attention away from their organization and toward a convenient scapegoat. "The documents need to look authentic," Marcus insisted. "Bank records, email correspondence, meeting schedules. If investigators can't verify the details, the whole narrative falls apart." "We can handle that," the older voice assured him. Morrison was sloppy. "Getting his real financial records won't be difficult. And the timeline has to be perfect. Every date I mention in the recording needs to match up with actual events in Morrison's life and the city planning calendar." As dawn approached, they had constructed a complete alternate narrative for the Westbridge investigation. Morrison emerged as the story's true villain, a corrupt official who had manipulated the media to eliminate his competition while protecting his own criminal enterprise. But Marcus had built something else into the story: insurance. "There's one more thing," he said as they prepared to make the final recording. "I need you to understand that this story doesn't just destroy Morrison, it also protects me." "How so?" "Because if anything happens to me after this recording is released, if I have an accident, if I disappear, if I suddenly decide to retract my stories, every law enforcement agency in the state will immediately suspect Morrison or his associates. You're not just buying his downfall, you're buying my continued safety." The calculation was cold but necessary. Marcus needed these people to have a vested interest in keeping him alive and healthy. The story he was crafting would make him more valuable as a living witness than as a dead martyr. "Smart," Gravelly voice admitted grudgingly. "I didn't survive 12 hours of light torture by being stupid," Marcus replied. As the sun rose over Portland, Marcus made his final recording. His voice carried the weight of genuine investigative authority, the credibility of a journalist who had built his reputation on exposing uncomfortable truths. Anyone listening would hear not just a news report, but a man whose life had been threatened for doing his job. "If you're hearing this recording," Marcus concluded, "it means something has happened to me, and you need to know the truth about Deputy City Planning Commissioner Jake Morrison and his role in corrupting Portland's development process." When he finished, the warehouse was quiet except for the hum of the industrial lights that had failed so spectacularly to break him. "So," Marcus said, settling back in his chair, "when do I go home?" The question hung in the air as his captors realized they were now committed to a course of action that would reshape Portland's political landscape and destroy a man's life, all to cover for their own criminal activities. But Marcus wasn't finished with his surprises. The story he'd just recorded was only the beginning of his plan. The morning light streaming through high warehouse windows meant nothing to Marcus, but he could feel the shift in atmosphere as his captors processed what they'd just committed to. They had crossed a line from incompetent kidnappers to active participants in destroying an innocent man's life. The weight of that decision was settling over them like dust. "There's just one problem," Marcus said casually, breaking the contemplative silence. "The story I just recorded? It's not going to work." The tension in the room spiked immediately. "What do you mean it won't work?" Gravelly voice demanded, his earlier nervousness returning with compound interest. "I mean that any competent investigator is going to spot the holes in about 5 minutes," Marcus replied, flexing his freed hands. "You think Morrison's lawyers are going to just roll over when this comes out? They're going to demand evidence, witness testimony, corroborating documentation, and when they can't find any of it, but we have his real financial records," a nervous voice protested. "The actual corruption, which proves he's corrupt, not that he approached me as a source. Those are two completely different things." Marcus shook his head. "Look, Morrison might be guilty of taking bribes, but he's innocent of manipulating my investigation. Any decent forensic accountant will be able to prove that the timeline doesn't match up with the payment schedules." The older voice spoke slowly, dangerously. "Are you saying you lied to us?" "I'm saying I gave you exactly what you asked for. A recording that shifts blame away from your organization and onto Morrison. But I never said it was bulletproof. You wanted a quick fix to a complex problem." Marcus paused, letting the implications sink in. "The thing is, I've been thinking about this situation from a different angle. You grabbed me because my investigation threatened your operation. But what if, instead of trying to discredit that investigation, we used it to strengthen your position?" "Explain," the older voice commanded. "Simple. Instead of making me the victim in this story, make me your asset." The suggestion landed like a bomb in the quiet warehouse. Marcus could practically hear their mental gears grinding as they tried to process what he was proposing. "You want to work for us?" a gravelly voice asked incredulously. "I want to propose a mutually beneficial arrangement. You let me go, I continue my investigative journalism, but with a new focus. Instead of targeting your operations, I target your competitors." Marcus had been developing this idea throughout the night, building on his observations of their amateur hour operation and their obvious desperation. These people weren't criminal masterminds. They were opportunists who had stumbled into something bigger than they could handle. "Think about it," he continued. "Right now, you're playing defense. Every investigative journalist in the city is a potential threat. Every city council meeting could expose another piece of your operation. But what if you had a journalist who was actively working to redirect attention toward your competitor's corruption?" The warehouse fell silent except for the distant hum of morning traffic. Marcus could sense their minds working, weighing the possibilities against the risks. "What exactly are you proposing?" the older voice asked carefully. "I continue doing what I do best, investigating corruption in city government. But instead of stumbling around randomly, you provide me with strategic intelligence about which officials and companies to target. I expose real corruption, maintain my credibility as an independent journalist, and you get to eliminate your competition through legitimate legal channels." It was a bold gambit, but Marcus had realized something important about his captors during their long night together. They weren't just criminals. They were business people who had turned to criminal methods because they lacked the sophistication for more elegant solutions. "And in return?" a nervous voice asked. "In return, you get a legitimate journalist who can destroy your enemies without any of it tracing back to you. Better than kidnapping, more effective than torture, and completely legal." Marcus could hear them exchanging glances, weighing the proposal against their current predicament. "There's still the problem of the original Westbridge story," Gravelly voice pointed out. "That investigation is still ongoing." "Actually, that's not a problem. It's an opportunity. I don't retract anything. Instead, I follow up with an even deeper investigation that expands beyond Westbridge to include their major competitors. Make it look like Westbridge was just the tip of the iceberg." The beauty of this approach, Marcus realized, was that it would actually serve the public interest while benefiting his captors. Corruption was endemic in Portland's development industry. By targeting their competitors, he'd be exposing real crimes and real criminals, just in a strategically beneficial order. "But how do we know you won't just take whatever information we give you and use it against us instead?" the older voice challenged. Marcus smiled. This was the crucial moment where his blindness became an asset rather than a disability. Because I still don't know who any of you are. I can't identify your faces, I don't know where we are, and I have no evidence that this conversation ever happened. You're gonna drive me back to Portland, drop me off, and disappear. As far as the world knows, I was never kidnapped. He paused, letting this sink in. But 6 months from now, when I publish an investigation that destroys Morrison's operation, or when I expose bid rigging at Cascade Development, or when I reveal kickback schemes at Northwest Contractors, you'll know it came from our arrangement. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Marcus would get his freedom and continue his career, while his captors would get a legitimate weapon against their competition. Both sides would benefit, and the public would ultimately get more thorough coverage of government corruption. How would the communication work? A nervous voice asked, clearly intrigued by the possibilities. Dead drops, anonymous tips. The same way investigative journalists have always worked with confidential sources. You feed me information about your competitors' operations, I investigate and publish. Clean, simple, untraceable. Marcus could feel the energy in the room shifting. The desperation and frustration of the failed torture session was being replaced by something like excitement. They were beginning to see possibilities instead of just problems. What about Morrison? A gravelly voice asked. We can't just let him walk away clean. Who says we're letting him walk? Morrison is genuinely corrupt. You said so yourselves. I just investigate him the right way, with real evidence and proper sourcing. It takes longer, but the conviction rate is much higher. The older voice was quiet for a long moment, thinking through the implications. This would require a significant level of trust, he said finally. No, it wouldn't. It would require a significant level of mutual benefit. I don't have to trust you, and you don't have to trust me. We just have to trust that both of us are smart enough to recognize a good deal. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, projecting confidence despite his vulnerable position. Look, you grabbed me because you thought I was a threat to your operation. But what if I told you that in the 6 weeks since my Westbridge story aired, I've received tips about corruption involving at least a dozen other companies? What if I told you that city planning is just one department, and I've got sources feeding me information about procurement, zoning, environmental permits, and public works contracts? He could hear their breathing change as they processed the implications. The corruption in this city runs deeper than any of us realized, but right now I'm investigating it randomly, following whatever leads come my way. Imagine if that investigation was strategically directed. You're talking about reshaping the entire Portland development industry, the older voice said slowly. I'm talking about cleaning houses in a way that benefits everyone, except the people who deserve to be destroyed. The silence stretched out as his captors contemplated the possibilities. Marcus had essentially offered to become their private weapon against their competitors, disguised as independent journalism. There's one more thing, Marcus added. If we do this, if we establish this arrangement, it protects all of us from future problems. You don't have to worry about me stumbling onto your operations by accident, because I'll know which investigations to avoid. And I don't have to worry about getting kidnapped again, because I'm more valuable as a partner than as a threat. The logic was sound, but Marcus knew he was asking them to make a fundamental shift in thinking. Instead of seeing journalists as enemies to be neutralized, they'd have to learn to see at least one journalist as an asset to be cultivated. How do we know you're as good as you claim? A nervous voice asked. The Westbridge story was solid, but it was just one investigation. Marcus grinned. Pull out your phone and do a search for Marcus Chen Portland Investigative Journalism. See how many corruption cases I've broken in the past 5 years. See how many officials have resigned, how many companies have lost city contracts, how many federal investigations have been triggered by my reporting. He waited while they presumably did exactly that. Impressive, the older voice admitted after a few minutes. Now imagine all of that investigative firepower directed strategically instead of randomly. Imagine your competitors having to deal with the kind of scrutiny that brought down Westbridge, except deeper, more thorough, and backed by federal resources. Marcus could sense the shift in the room's energy. The fear and desperation were being replaced by something like anticipation. They were beginning to see him not as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity to be seized. "If we agree to this," a gravelly voice said slowly, "how do we know you won't eventually turn on us?" "Because I am a journalist, not a saint. I investigate corruption that hurts people. Families who can't get decent housing, workers dealing with unsafe conditions, taxpayers whose money gets stolen. If your operation doesn't hurt people, it's not a story I'm interested in." It was a carefully calibrated answer. Marcus was offering them a form of immunity based not on friendship or loyalty, but on professional ethics. As long as their corruption didn't cause direct harm to vulnerable populations, he'd focus his attention elsewhere. "And if it does hurt people," the older voice pressed, "then you'll have bigger problems than one investigative journalist." The answer carried an implicit threat, but also a form of moral guidance. Marcus was essentially offering to be their conscience as well as their weapon, keeping them focused on profitable but relatively harmless corruption while destroying their more ruthless competitors. As the morning sun climbed higher, Marcus waited for their decision, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether he walked out of this warehouse as a victim or as a very unusual kind of business partner. The decision, when it came, arrived not through dramatic pronouncement but through a series of small concessions that accumulated into acceptance. First, the older voice asked about communication protocols. Then a nervous voice inquired about timeline expectations. Finally, a gravelly voice wanted to know about operational security measures. Marcus recognized the pattern. They weren't negotiating anymore. They were planning. "We'll need to establish some ground rules," the older voice said, his tone shifting from interrogator to business partner. "This arrangement works both ways. You don't investigate us, we don't interfere with your other stories." "Agreed, but I need something in return. Information about the broader landscape. If I'm going to strategically target your competitors, I need to understand the full scope of corruption in the city. Who's connected to whom, which officials are bought, how the money flows." Marcus was asking for something extraordinary, a comprehensive map of Portland's shadow economy, but he was also offering something equally valuable in return. "That's a significant amount of sensitive information," a nervous voice pointed out. "Which is why this arrangement is built on mutual assured destruction. If I betray you, I'm admitting to conspiracy, and my journalism career is over. If you betray me, I publish everything you've told me, and your entire operation collapses." The logic was cold but sound. Neither side could destroy the other without destroying themselves. "There's another issue," gravelly voice interjected. "The people above us. They're expecting Morrison to be neutralized today. How do we explain that the operation succeeded without actually neutralizing him?" Marcus had been anticipating this problem. His captors were middle management, which meant they answered to someone else, someone with expectations and deadlines. Simple. You tell them the truth, but not the whole truth. You tell them that Marcus Chen has been convinced to redirect his investigations away from your operations and toward your competitors. You don't mention the kidnapping, the failed torture, or the specific arrangement we've made. And Morrison? Morrison gets investigated legitimately, but it takes 6 months instead of 6 hours. Your bosses get what they want, the heat taken off their operations. They just have to wait a little longer for the specific target to be eliminated. The beauty of this approach was that it would actually strengthen Marcus's position within his own organization. Instead of being seen as a journalist who got kidnapped and compromised, he'd be seen as someone whose investigation had expanded and deepened. "We'll need to test this arrangement on a smaller scale first," the older voice decided. "Something low risk to see if you can actually deliver what you're promising." "Fair enough. What did you have in mind?" "Riverside Construction. They've been undercutting our bids for the past year by cutting corners on safety standards and using undocumented workers. Their owner, David Kellerman, has been paying off building inspectors to look the other way." Marcus filed away the information, already thinking through how to structure an investigation. What kind of evidence are we talking about? Photos of unsafe work sites, payroll records showing cash payments to workers with no documentation, bank transfers to Inspector Frank Rodriguez's personal account. How recent? The photos are from last week. The payroll records cover the past 6 months. The bank transfers, those are ongoing. Marcus nodded. This was exactly the kind of story that would serve multiple purposes: exposing genuine corruption that harmed workers, eliminating a competitor to his captor's business, and establishing his credibility as an independent investigator. "I'll need the evidence delivered anonymously, nothing that can be traced back to your organization. and I'll need at least 2 weeks to properly investigate and corroborate everything." 2 weeks seems like a long time, a nervous voice objected. "Good journalism takes time. If you wanted something fast and sloppy, you should have stuck with the kidnapping approach. But if you want something that will actually destroy Kellerman's operation and hold up in court, you give me the time to do it right." Quote. The conversation was interrupted by the buzz of a cell phone. A gravelly voice answered with a terse, "Yeah?" Marcus could only hear one side of the conversation, but the body language told him everything he needed to know. Gravelly voice was getting increasingly tense, his responses becoming shorter and more defensive. "I understand, sir. Yes, sir, we'll have a resolution today." He ended the call and immediately turned to his partners. "The boss is getting impatient. He wants confirmation that the problem has been solved." "Tell him it has been," Marcus said calmly. "Tell him that Marcus Chen is no longer a threat to the organization's operations. That's not a lie, it's just not the complete picture. And if he asks for details, then you tell him that operational security requires keeping details compartmentalized. The less he knows about the specific methods, the better protected he is if anything goes wrong." Marcus was coaching them in the art of managing upward, teaching them how to give their superior what he wanted to hear without revealing information that could compromise the new arrangement. But what if he wants proof? What if he wants to see you neutralized? The euphemism hung in the air like smoke. Marcus realized that his captor's boss might have expected them to kill him, not just intimidate him into silence. "Then you show him this," Marcus said, thinking quickly. "You record me making a statement that says I've received credible threats related to my investigation, and that I'm temporarily suspending my reporting on city planning issues pending a security review." "That's not going to satisfy him," the older voice warned. "It will if you frame it correctly. You tell him that killing a prominent journalist would bring too much heat, too much federal attention. But a journalist who's been scared into silence? That's a clean victory with no unwanted complications." Marcus could sense them weighing this explanation against their knowledge of their superior's expectations and temperament. "Record the statement," the gravelly voice decided, "but make it convincing. He'll know if you're just going through the motions." For the second time that morning, Marcus found himself speaking into a recording device. But this performance was different. Instead of the confident investigative journalist, he projected fear and uncertainty. "This is Marcus Chen. I'm making this statement to confirm that I've received credible threats related to my ongoing investigation into city planning corruption. These threats have made it clear that continuing this line of reporting could put myself and others at risk." His voice carried just the right note of reluctant defeat, the sound of a man who'd been outmaneuvered and knew it. "Effective immediately, I'm suspending all reporting related to city planning, zoning, and development issues pending a comprehensive security review. I want to make it clear that this decision is mine alone, and that I have not been influenced or coerced by any outside parties." The last line was a masterpiece of misdirection, technically true while completely obscuring the actual circumstances of the recording. "That should buy us some time," Marcus said when he finished. "Your boss gets proof that the problem has been neutralized, and we get space to develop our working relationship." But even as he said it, Marcus was already thinking several moves ahead. This arrangement with his captors was a means to an end, not an end in itself. He had larger plans that they couldn't see yet. "Now," he continued, "let's talk about my release. How exactly do you plan to get me back to Portland without raising questions?" "We drive you back downtown, drop you off near where we grabbed you, and you make your own way home," a nervous voice suggested. "And what's my story? I've been missing for almost 18 hours. People will have questions." Marcus could sense them realizing they hadn't thought through this aspect of the operation. Amateur criminals often focused on the crime itself without considering the aftermath. "You went to visit a friend out of town," a gravelly voice suggested. "Decided to stay overnight. I'm a creature of habit. People who know me know I don't make spontaneous overnight trips, and I'll have missed my radio show last night, which means my producer will have been trying to reach me." "So what do you suggest?" the older voice asked. "I tell a version of the truth. I was approached by someone claiming to have information about the West Bridge investigation. They convinced me to meet them at a location outside the city. When I got there, it turned out to be a setup. They wanted to scare me into dropping the story." Marcus paused, working out the details of his cover story. I'll say they held me overnight, made threats, but ultimately decided that killing a journalist would bring too much attention. So they let me go with a warning to stay away from city planning stories. That's dangerously close to what actually happened, a nervous voice pointed out. Which is why it'll be believable. The best lies are mostly truth, with just the important details changed. And if the police want to investigate, I'll tell them I can't identify my captors because they wore masks, and that I can't identify the location because they blindfolded me during transport. All of which will be technically true from my perspective. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. His blindness, which had made their torture ineffective, would also make him the perfect witness to a crime that officially never happened. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Marcus said. Insurance. What kind of insurance? The kind that keeps all of us safe if this arrangement goes sideways. I'm going to prepare a detailed account of everything that's happened here, including our new arrangement. That account goes into a secure location with instructions for release if anything happens to me. That sounds like a threat, a gravelly voice said dangerously. It's not a threat. It's protection for both of us. If your organization decides I'm too dangerous to keep alive, they'll know that killing me will expose everything. But if someone else decides to eliminate me to protect their own interests, you'll know it wasn't me who betrayed the arrangement. Marcus could hear them thinking through the implications. The insurance policy protected him from them, but it also protected them from being blamed if someone else targeted him. What exactly would this account contain? The older voice asked. Everything. The kidnapping, the failed torture, Morrison, Kellerman, our arrangement, and most importantly, proof that you're working with me voluntarily, not under duress. If that account ever sees daylight, it clears you of any accusations of ongoing criminal activity. It was a carefully crafted protection scheme that served multiple purposes. It kept Marcus alive, it gave his captors plausible deniability, and it created a permanent record of their cooperation that could be valuable if the relationship ever needed to be formalized or expanded. You've thought of everything, haven't you? The older voice said with something approaching admiration. I've had all night to think, Marcus replied, and I've been planning my next career move for longer than that. Your next career move? Marcus smiled. Did you really think I wanted to be a small-time radio journalist forever? This arrangement isn't just about solving your current problem. It's about building something bigger. Something that could reshape how corruption gets exposed and prosecuted in this city. He could sense their curiosity, their growing realization that they might have stumbled into partnership with someone whose ambitions matched their own. But that's a conversation for another day, Marcus continued. Right now, let's focus on getting me home safely so we can start this experiment properly. As his captors began making preparations for his release, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary turn his life had taken. 18 hours ago, he'd been a blind radio journalist walking to work. Now he was about to become something unprecedented. A legitimate investigative journalist, with his own network of criminal informants. The irony was perfect. They'd tried to blind him with light, not knowing he was already blind. And in failing to break him, they'd given him exactly what he needed to see more clearly than ever before. The ride back to Portland took place in a different vehicle than the one that had brought Marcus to the warehouse. He could tell by the engine sound, the suspension, and the way the radio was tuned to a different station. His captors were being careful about evidence, which suggested they were learning to think like professionals rather than amateurs. Drop me at Pioneer Courthouse Square, Marcus instructed as they entered downtown traffic. It's public, well-lit, plenty of witnesses, and close enough to my apartment that walking home won't seem unusual. What if someone asks why you were gone all night? A nervous voice asked from the passenger seat. Let me worry about my cover story. You focus on yours. The dynamic between them had fundamentally shifted during their overnight negotiation. Marcus was no longer their prisoner. He was their consultant, advising them on how to manage the aftermath of their own crime. Remember, he continued, when you report to your boss, emphasize results, not methods. Marcus Chen is no longer investigating your operations. That's what matters. How you achieved that result is an operational detail that doesn't concern him. And if he insists on details, quote, then you tell him the truth, that Chen was convinced that continuing his investigation would be professionally and personally dangerous. You don't mention kidnapping, torture, or our arrangement. You focus on the outcome he wanted. As they pulled into the square, Marcus could hear the familiar sounds of downtown Portland waking up, early commuters, delivery trucks, the distinctive bell of the Max light rail. After 18 hours in the windowless warehouse, the urban symphony felt like coming home. "One more thing," a gravelly voice said as the car stopped. "The first package will be delivered within 48 hours. Look for a manila envelope slipped under your apartment door. No return address, no postmark." "Understood. And remember, I need at least 2 weeks to properly investigate Kellerman. Don't expect instant results." Marcus climbed out of the car, oriented himself using the square's familiar landmarks, and began walking toward his apartment. Behind him, he heard the vehicle pull away, carrying his former captors back to whatever legitimate business they used as cover. The walk home gave him time to process what had happened and plan his next moves. By the time he reached his building, Marcus had constructed a detailed timeline of the cover story he'd need to maintain. His apartment felt different when he entered, not because anything had been moved. His captors had been careful about that, but because he was different. The man who had left this apartment yesterday morning had been a small-time investigative journalist with good instincts and limited resources. The man returning was something unprecedented, a legitimate reporter with access to criminal intelligence networks. The first call came within minutes of his arrival. "Marcus? Thank God!" His producer, Sarah Kim, sounded frantic. "I've been trying to reach you all night. You missed the show, your phone went straight to voicemail. I was about to call the police." "I'm sorry, Sarah. Something came up with the Westbridge investigation. I had to follow a lead that took me out of town overnight." "Why didn't you call? You've never missed a show without notice." Marcus had anticipated this question. The source was paranoid about phone communication. They insisted on a face-to-face meeting, and they wouldn't tell me the location until the last minute. By the time I realized it was going to take all night, it was too late to arrange coverage. "That doesn't sound like you. You're always prepared for contingencies." Sarah knew him well enough to spot inconsistencies in his story. Marcus needed to give her something closer to the truth. "Look, Sarah, I need to tell you something, but it stays between us for now. Last night's meeting, it didn't go the way I expected. The person who contacted me wasn't actually a source. They were representing people who wanted me to stop investigating city planning corruption." The silence on the other end of the line stretched for several seconds. "Marcus, are you saying you were threatened?" "I'm saying I was given a very clear message about the consequences of continuing certain lines of investigation, and I need time to figure out how to respond. We should call the police, we should call the FBI. This is—" "No," Marcus's voice carried enough authority to stop her mid-sentence. "Not yet. I need to think through the implications, and I need to decide how much of this I'm willing to make public." "But Marcus—" "Sarah, trust me on this. I had been doing investigative journalism for 5 years. I know when to push forward and when to step back. Right now, I need to step back." After he hung up, Marcus sat in his familiar chair and began planning his double life. To the outside world, he would appear to be a journalist who had been intimidated into backing down from his most important investigation. But in reality, he would be launching the most comprehensive corruption investigation in Portland's history. The first test came sooner than expected. 2 hours after returning home, Marcus received a call from Detective Lisa Rodriguez with the Portland Police Bureau. "Mr. Chen, we've received a report that you were missing last night. Your producer was concerned when you didn't show up for your radio program." "I appreciate the concern, Detective, but I wasn't missing. I was following up on a lead related to my investigation into city planning corruption." "Can you provide details about where you were and who you met with?" Marcus had rehearsed this conversation during his walk home. "I met with someone who claimed to have additional information about the Westbridge construction story. The meeting took place outside the city, and it lasted longer than expected." "Why didn't you contact your producer or anyone else to let them know your plans had changed?" "The source was extremely nervous about security. They insisted on no phone communication during our meeting." "Mr. Chen, I have to ask, were you threatened or coerced in any way during this meeting?" The question hung in the air while Marcus considered his response. Telling the truth would mean revealing the kidnapping, which would compromise his new arrangement. But lying to a police officer carried its own risks. "Detective, I'd prefer not to go into details about the content of that meeting right now. I'm still evaluating the information I received and deciding how to proceed. That's not really an answer to my question. It's the only answer I can give you at this time. Detective Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, clearly frustrated by his evasiveness. Mr. Chen, if you've been threatened, or if you're concerned about your safety, we can provide protection, but you have to be honest with us about what happened. I understand, Detective. If I decide I need police assistance, you'll be my first call. After ending the conversation, Marcus realized he'd crossed another line. He was now actively misleading law enforcement to protect his arrangement with his former captors. The journalist who had always prided himself on transparency and truth-telling was becoming something more complex and morally ambiguous. The package arrived exactly 48 hours later, just as the gravelly voice had promised. A manila envelope slipped under his door while he was at the radio station, containing everything he needed to destroy David Kellerman's construction empire. The photographs were damning: workers on scaffolding without safety harnesses, electrical installations that violated building codes, concrete being poured over rebar that was clearly substandard. Each image was time-stamped and location-stamped, providing irrefutable evidence of ongoing safety violations. The payroll records were equally devastating. Cash payments to workers with no tax documentation, no workers' compensation coverage, no OSHA compliance training. Names, dates, amounts, everything an investigative journalist would need to prove systematic exploitation of undocumented labor. But the bank transfer records were the crown jewel of the evidence package. Monthly payments from Kellerman's personal account to Inspector Frank Rodriguez, each transfer occurring within days of Rodriguez signing off on inspections of Riverside construction projects. Marcus spread the documents across his dining table, analyzing them with the systematic approach he'd developed over years of investigative work. The evidence was genuine. He could tell by the paper quality, the formatting consistency, the way the data interconnected across multiple sources. But more than that, the evidence told a story that made emotional sense. Kellerman wasn't just cutting corners to increase profits. He was systematically endangering workers and bribing officials to avoid consequences. This was exactly the kind of corruption that Marcus had built his career exposing. Over the following week, Marcus began the careful work of building his investigation. He couldn't simply publish the leaked documents. That would raise questions about his sources and potentially compromise his arrangement. Instead, he had to construct an independent investigation that would lead him to the same conclusions through seemingly legitimate channels. He started by filing public records requests for all building permits issued to Riverside Construction over the past 2 years. He interviewed former employees who had left the company, asking careful questions about working conditions and safety protocols. He visited construction sites and took his own photographs of safety violations. Most importantly, he began building a case against Inspector Rodriguez through independent investigation. Bank records were private, but property records were public. By tracking Rodriguez's recent purchases and comparing them to his official salary, Marcus could demonstrate a lifestyle that exceeded his legitimate income. The investigation took on a life of its own. What had started as a favor to his former captors became a genuine crusade against dangerous and exploitative business practices. Marcus found himself working 18-hour days, driven by the same passion for justice that had originally drawn him to investigative journalism. 2 weeks after receiving the evidence package, Marcus published his exposé on Riverside Construction. The story ran as a 3-part series on his radio show, supported by a comprehensive web presentation with photographs, documents, and audio interviews. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within hours of the first broadcast, the Oregon Occupational Safety and Health Administration launched an investigation. The state attorney general opened a criminal inquiry into bribery allegations against Inspector Rodriguez. 3 workers came forward with complaints about unsafe working conditions, and 2 filed lawsuits for workplace injuries that had been covered up. David Kellerman's empire collapsed in less than a week. Riverside Construction lost its business license, Rodriguez was arrested on corruption charges, and the story triggered a broader investigation into building inspection practices across the city. But for Marcus, the most significant outcome was a phone call he received 3 days after the story broke. "Impressive work," the older voice said when Marcus answered. "Very thorough, very professional. Kellerman won't be undercutting anyone's bids anymore." "It was good journalism," Marcus replied. "The kind of story I'd have pursued regardless of our arrangement. That's what makes this partnership so effective. You're not doing anything you wouldn't normally do. You're just doing it strategically." "Speaking of strategy, I've been thinking about our next target." "Oh?" Marcus smiled, settling back in his chair. Over the past 2 weeks, he'd realized something important about his new situation. His former captors thought they were using him to eliminate their competition, but Marcus was actually using them to build something much larger, a comprehensive map of corruption in Portland that he could systematically dismantle. "Tell me about Northwest Environmental Services," he said. "I've been hearing interesting things about their waste disposal contracts." The conversation that followed lasted for over an hour, as Marcus learned about another piece of Portland's shadow economy. By the time he hung up, he had enough information to launch an investigation that would reshape the city's environmental compliance industry. As he sat in his apartment, surrounded by the tools of his trade, recording equipment, research files, contact lists, Marcus reflected on the strange turn his life had taken. 6 months ago, he'd been a blind radio journalist, doing his best to expose corruption with limited resources and access. Now he was something unprecedented. A legitimate investigative journalist with a criminal intelligence network, systematically dismantling the corruption infrastructure of an entire city. The irony was perfect. His captors had tried to blind him with light, not knowing he was already blind. In failing to break him, they'd given him vision more powerful than sight itself, the ability to see into the shadows where corruption flourished, and the tools to drag it into the light where it would die. Marcus Chen was no longer just a journalist. He was an architect of justice, building a new model for how corruption could be exposed and eliminated. And his greatest weapon wasn't his sight, his sources, or his skills as an investigator. His greatest weapon was the fact that no one, not his former captors, not his colleagues, not the corrupt officials he was hunting, understood the full scope of what he was building. In trying to torture him with blinding light, they had given him the darkness he needed to see everything clearly, and Marcus was just getting started. 6 months after the Riverside construction exposé, Marcus Chen had become the most feared investigative journalist in Portland. His radio show had expanded from a late-night program to prime time, his investigations had triggered 14 federal inquiries, and his name was whispered in City Hall corridors with a mixture of respect and terror. But the most remarkable transformation was invisible to everyone except Marcus himself. The Northwest Environmental Services investigation had unraveled a waste disposal conspiracy that reached into 3 counties. The subsequent probe into Pacific Development Group had exposed a land speculation scheme involving 2 state senators. Each story built on the last, creating a comprehensive picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond what anyone had imagined possible. Marcus's apartment had become an informal intelligence center. File cabinets lined the walls, filled with evidence packages delivered by his anonymous partners. A sophisticated audio setup allowed him to conduct interviews and produce content that reached audiences across the Pacific Northwest. Most importantly, a secure communication system enabled him to coordinate with sources throughout the criminal underground. To the outside world, Marcus appeared to be an investigative journalist who had developed an extraordinary network of whistleblowers and inside sources. The truth was far more complex and far more dangerous. "The mayor's office is getting nervous," Gravelly Voice reported during one of their monthly strategy sessions. "Your investigation into the affordable housing contracts is making some very powerful people uncomfortable." "Good," Marcus replied, reviewing files with his fingertips. "Comfortably powerful people don't make mistakes. Nervous, powerful people get sloppy." Over the past 6 months, Marcus had learned to read his criminal partners as clearly as he read the Braille documents they provided. Gravelly Voice had evolved from a desperate kidnapper to sophisticated intelligence coordinator. Nervous Voice had developed into an expert document forger who could create paper trails that would satisfy any federal auditor. The older Voice had revealed himself to be a former city planning official who possessed institutional knowledge spanning 3 decades. "There's something else," the older Voice said during their call. "We've been approached by similar operations in Seattle and Sacramento. They want to know if our arrangement could be franchised." Marcus had been anticipating this development. Success attracts attention, and his systematic destruction of corrupt networks had not gone unnoticed by criminals in other cities. What exactly are they proposing? The same basic model. They provide intelligence about their competitors' criminal activities. You investigate and expose them through legitimate journalism. Everyone benefits except the people who deserve to be destroyed. And in return, they're offering to share intelligence about corruption networks that cross state lines, multi-city conspiracies that no single local journalist could uncover alone. Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. What had started as a desperate attempt to escape torture had evolved into something unprecedented, a criminal intelligence network that served the cause of justice. Set up a meeting, but not here, and not with me directly involved. I want to evaluate their operations before I commit to anything. As his criminal partnership expanded, Marcus's legitimate career reached new heights. The Portland Tribune had offered him a position as chief investigative correspondent. The Columbia Journalism Review had featured his work on their cover. 3 major news networks had approached him about television opportunities. But Marcus had turned down every offer, preferring to maintain his independence and his carefully constructed double life. The personal cost of his transformation was becoming harder to ignore. Sarah Kim, his longtime producer, had begun asking uncomfortable questions about his sources and methods. Detective Rodriguez had made several more attempts to interview him about ongoing corruption cases. Most troubling, Marcus had begun receiving attention from federal agencies whose interest went beyond professional curiosity. "We need to discuss operational security," Marcus told his partners during what had become their weekly coordination call. "My profile is getting too high. People are starting to ask the right questions." "What kind of questions?" a nervous voice asked. "Questions about how one journalist can consistently break stories that federal task forces have been investigating for years. Questions about how I obtain evidence that requires search warrants for law enforcement to access. Questions about whether my sources might be more than just concerned citizens." The silence on the other end of the call told Marcus that his partners had been worrying about the same issues. "So what do you propose?" the older voice asked. "We evolve. Instead of me being the sole public face of these investigations, we start developing other journalists, other outlets. We build a network that doesn't depend on any single person." Marcus had been developing this concept for weeks. The current arrangement was too fragile, too dependent on his unique position and his partner's criminal access. To truly reshape how corruption was exposed and prosecuted, they needed something more sustainable. "You're talking about recruiting other journalists into criminal conspiracies," gravelly voice pointed out. "I'm talking about creating a model where journalists can access criminal intelligence without becoming criminals themselves. Anonymous tips, leaked documents, protected sources, all the traditional tools of investigative journalism, but systematically organized instead of randomly distributed." The idea was ambitious, but Marcus had proven that the basic concept worked. 6 months of successful investigations had demonstrated that criminal intelligence networks could be weaponized for legitimate journalism, without compromising either the criminals or the journalists involved. "There's another issue we need to address," Marcus continued. "Morrison." The name fell into the conversation like a stone into still water. Deputy City Planning Commissioner Jake Morrison had been the original target of their failed frame job, the man whose life they had planned to destroy to protect their operations. "What about Morrison?" the older voice asked carefully. "He's still out there, still corrupt, still taking bribes from your competitors. Our original plan to neutralize him fell apart when we changed strategies, but the underlying problem remains." Quote, Marcus had been tracking Morrison's activities through public records and his expanding source network. The deputy commissioner was not only continuing his corrupt practices, but had actually expanded his operations, perhaps emboldened by the lack of investigative attention. "You want to go after him legitimately," a nervous voice said. "It wasn't a question. I want to finish what we started. Morrison represents everything wrong with the current system. A mid-level official who thinks his position makes him untouchable. Taking him down sends a message to every other corrupt bureaucrat in the city. And it tests whether our new approach can handle targets who know they're being hunted," a gravelly voice added with grudging admiration. Marcus smiled. His former captors had learned to think strategically, to see beyond immediate problems to larger objectives. The Morrison investigation became Marcus's most challenging project yet. Unlike previous targets who had been caught off guard by his exposés, Morrison was actively trying to cover his tracks. The deputy commissioner had hired a private security firm, implemented new communication protocols, and begun laundering his bribe money through a series of shell companies. But Morrison had one critical weakness. He didn't know about Marcus's criminal intelligence network. "He's meeting with Cascade Development tomorrow night," the older voice reported during a strategy session. "Pier 47, Warehouse District, 11 p.m. They're finalizing the payment schedule for the waterfront rezoning project." "How do you know?" "Because we're supposed to be bidding on the same project. Morrison's been playing all the development companies against each other, driving up the bribe prices while promising each of us exclusive access." Marcus filed away this information, already planning how to position surveillance equipment at the meeting location. But he also recognized a larger opportunity. What if we expose the entire bidding corruption scheme, not just Morrison's involvement? Show how multiple companies are being manipulated into bidding wars that benefit nobody except Morrison? "That would implicate us as well," a nervous voice pointed out. "Not if we structure it correctly. Your organization becomes whistleblowers, not co-conspirators. You provide evidence of Morrison's corruption to protect yourselves from his extortion scheme." Quote, "It was a sophisticated approach that would allow Marcus's partners to emerge from the investigation as victims rather than criminals, while simultaneously destroying Morrison's operation and deterring future corruption. The sting operation took 3 weeks to plan and execute. Marcus coordinated with his partners to document Morrison's meetings with multiple development companies, recording conversations where the deputy commissioner explicitly demanded bribes in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. The evidence was overwhelming: audio recordings, financial documents, photographs of cash exchanges. But Marcus took an additional step that surprised even his criminal partners. He submitted the evidence to the FBI. "You did what?" Gravelly voice demanded when Marcus informed them of his decision. "I gave the Morrison evidence to federal agents. Not directly, through an anonymous tip line, but I made sure they got everything." "Why would you involve federal law enforcement?" "Because this investigation is bigger than local corruption. Morrison's scheme involves federal housing grants, environmental impact assessments, and interstate commerce regulations. It requires federal prosecution to be fully effective." Marcus had realized something important during his months of investigating Portland's corruption networks. Local prosecutors were often compromised by political relationships and career considerations. Federal agents operated with different constraints and different objectives. "Besides," he continued, "having federal backing legitimizes everything we've accomplished. When the FBI arrests Morrison using evidence from our investigation, it validates our methods and protects us from accusations of vigilante journalism." The Morrison arrest made national news. Federal agents had not only charged the deputy commissioner with bribery and extortion, but had also seized evidence of a broader corruption network involving multiple city officials and development companies. Marcus's role in the investigation was portrayed exactly as he had planned: a tenacious journalist who had developed sources within the corrupt system and used their information to expose criminal activity. His criminal partners were mentioned only as quote, 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 who had been victimized by Morrison's extortion scheme. But the most significant outcome was the attention the case attracted from other journalists and law enforcement agencies across the country. "Seattle wants to replicate your model," Sarah Kim told Marcus during their weekly production meeting. "The Times is sending a reporter to interview you about your investigative methods." "What kind of methods are they interested in?" "Source development, evidence verification, coordination with law enforcement. They want to understand how you've been so successful at exposing corruption that other journalists have missed." Marcus had been preparing for this moment since his partnership began. He had developed a public explanation for his success that was truthful without being complete. "Tell them I focus on building long-term relationships with people inside corrupt systems. Instead of trying to expose everything at once, I work systematically to build comprehensive cases that can withstand legal scrutiny." It was an accurate description of his approach, carefully crafted to avoid mentioning his criminal intelligence network while explaining his extraordinary success rate. The Seattle interview led to similar requests from journalists in Sacramento, Denver, and Phoenix. Marcus found himself becoming an inadvertent teacher, sharing techniques and strategies that other investigative journalists could adapt to their own cities. "You're creating a movement," the older voice observed during one of their strategy calls. "Other journalists are starting to investigate corruption more systematically, more strategically." "That was always the goal," Marcus replied. What we've built here in Portland is a proof of concept. The real impact comes when other cities develop similar approaches. But even as his influence expanded, Marcus was planning his next evolution. The criminal intelligence network that had enabled his success was becoming too visible, too dependent on his direct involvement. To truly transform investigative journalism, he needed to create something that could operate independently of any single person or organization. "I've been thinking about our long-term strategy," he told his partners during what would be their final coordination call. "This arrangement has accomplished everything we originally intended, but it's also created new opportunities and new risks." What kind of opportunities? The opportunity to formalize what we've created. To build an organization that can coordinate between investigative journalists and intelligence sources across multiple cities, multiple states. Quote, Marcus had spent months developing this concept, a legitimate nonprofit organization that would serve as an intermediary between journalists and sources, providing resources and protection for both sides while maintaining operational security. And the risks? The risk that our success attracts the wrong kind of attention. Federal agencies are starting to ask questions about how corruption investigations have become so much more effective in Portland. Eventually, someone's going to realize that it's not just better journalism, it's better intelligence. The conversation that followed lasted for 3 hours as Marcus outlined his vision for institutionalizing their approach. Instead of individual journalists working with individual criminal networks, he proposed creating a structured system that could operate transparently and legally while maintaining the effectiveness they had demonstrated. 6 months later, the Northwest Investigative Coalition opened its offices in downtown Portland. The organization's mission was to provide resources, training, and coordination support for investigative journalists working on corruption cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. Marcus Chen served as the coalition's founding director, bringing together journalists, law enforcement officials, and private sector experts to develop new approaches to exposing and prosecuting systematic corruption. To the outside world, the coalition appeared to be a natural evolution of Marcus's successful investigative work, a way to share his methods and resources with other journalists. But the organization also served another purpose that only Marcus fully understood. The coalition provided a legitimate cover for the intelligence networks that had made his investigations possible. Former criminals who wanted to redirect their inside knowledge toward legitimate purposes could work with the coalition as consultants and researchers. Law enforcement agencies could share information and resources without compromising ongoing investigations. Journalists could access sophisticated intelligence without being compromised by criminal associations. The final irony of Marcus's transformation was that he had accomplished something unprecedented in the history of investigative journalism. He had created a sustainable system for turning criminal intelligence networks into forces for justice, all while maintaining his reputation as an independent ethical journalist. The men who had tried to torture him with blinding light had unknowingly given him the greatest gift possible, the motivation and the means to see corruption more clearly than anyone before him. Marcus Chen was no longer just a blind radio journalist who had survived a kidnapping. He was the architect of a new model for justice, one that turned the tools of corruption against itself and used the darkness of criminal networks to bring light to the shadows where corruption flourished. And the most beautiful part was that his greatest enemies had helped him build it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.